First, we import React along with the useState and useEffect hooks. useState allows us to track state within a function component, and useEffect lets us perform side effects, such as data fetching. Now, we're going to define a functional component named conditional component. Within this component, we will utilize our hooks to manage state and side effects. Here, we're declaring our conditional component. We declare a state variable named data by calling useState, and we initialize it as null, to represent the absence of data before fetching. Similarly, we set up a loading state to keep track of whether our data is currently being fetched. By default, we set it to true, indicating that we're loading data when the component mounts. Now we introduce the useEffect hook, which will handle the side effect of data fetching. Inside our effect, we define an asynchronous function called fetchData. This pattern allows us to use async await syntax within the hook. We start a try-catch block to handle any potential errors during the fetch operation. Within the try block, we make an asynchronous call to fetch data from our API endpoint. Be sure to replace myAPI endpoint with the URL of your actual data source. Assuming the fetch call is successful, we then process the response to convert it into JSON format, which gives us the result that can be used within our component. Subsequently, we call setData with the fetched result. This updates our data state and re-renders our component with the fetched data. If an error occurs during fetching or processing the data, we move to the catch block. Here, we log the error to the console, useful for debugging purposes. The finally block executes regardless of the try-catch outcome, and it's a great place to stop our loading indicator. We set the loading state to false, indicating that our data fetching operation is complete. We close off our fetchData function here. After defining the fetchData function, it's time to invoke it. This call is placed directly inside the useEffect, which tells React to execute fetchData after the component mounts. We pass an empty array as the second argument to useEffect, which means the effect will run only once, similar to component didMount in class components. Finally, we reach the rendering logic of our component. Our component returns the JSX, which is the part of the code that describes the UI. We start with a parent div element that will conditionally render its children. We use a ternary operator to check our loading state variable. If it's true, we will display a loading message. This paragraph is what users will see while the data is being fetched. If the loading is false, we then check if we have data. If data is not null, we move on to render the data. This div will contain the representation of our data. It's crucial to properly format and render the data based on your application's requirements. For demonstration purposes, we're using a pre-tag with JSON stringify to nicely format and display the fetched data as a string. We close the div that contains our data representation. If both loading is false and data is null, which could mean our fetch call failed or returned no data, we display a fallback message. This message informs the user that no data has been found or an error occurred. We conclude the ternary operator. We close our parent div element. And we end the return statement of our component. Now we close off the conditional component function. The last step in our component is to make it available for use in other parts of our application. We do so by exporting the conditional component as the default export of our module. And that's it. You've now created a component with conditional rendering based on fetched data.